last day in Nehemiah. So if you were hoping for that, it's here finally for you. We're going to start at the beginning of chapter 13. We're going to read the first 3 verses, and then I'll kind of step back for a second. So Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1. On that day, so what is on that day? There's several phrases like that. On that day, if you go back, we were just reading about how they signed the covenant and they were preparing for worship. So this is in that time frame, and it says, on that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. For they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. So this sounds like what we've been reading. They read through the law that they've been given, their Bible at that time, and they made several changes. They saw things that they weren't doing that they should be doing, and so we saw a big reform. If you remember chapter 8, they read the law. Chapter 9 was this great prayer of confession for themselves and their fathers, how they have failed to uphold the law. And then chapter 10, they signed this covenant that said we are not going to be like that, and we are going to commit to this covenant that we're under. And so we see more in the first 3 verses of chapter 13. So what I want to do today is we're going to move through the rest of chapter 13 kind of in blocks, and then I want to leave a little bit of time at the end just to wrap this up and hear from you some of the takeaways maybe over the whole book. And I was thinking that if you've read chapter 13, you know where I'm headed with this, but if we would have done this after the first 12 chapters, it would be a lot different discussion than if we do it after this chapter. One observation that was pointed out, David pointed out to me last week, and if I don't say it right, you can help me. He was reflecting on the fact that these, we just saw the dedication of the wall, and they had this big ceremony to commit this to the Lord. And he was sharing that these are the same people who, in chapter 1, Nehemiah says they were filled with shame, they were despised, and I can't remember the exact wording. They were in bad shape. These are the same people who are now triumphantly dedicating the wall to the Lord. And I think your point was that it took a leader who was a God-fearing leader to come in and help them from that point to the point we left them last week. But then we have chapter 13. And chapter 13 should, if nothing else, give us confidence that this was not a legend or a story that was made up, because nobody writing this story would end this book with chapter 13. So, before we get into chapter 13, Dale, do you have that slide? Maybe not. If you don't, we'll do it later. Okay, we'll come back to that later. I've got a quote from J.I. Packer. So let's start with verse 4. We're going to just kind of go through a block, we'll talk about it, and then move on. Now before this, another time reference, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God. So if you remember last week, we talked about the chambers, and I said to remember that for this week. The chambers were where they stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the vessels, the tithes, the wine and the oil for the worship. So Eliashib was the priest who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah. Now that word related is in the ESV. A couple other versions have allied with or closely associated with. So the actual word there doesn't necessarily mean related. The ESV and I think the NASB both have chosen that because of what we'll read later. So closely associated with, allied with, he was connected with Tobiah. So what do we know about Tobiah so far? Trouble. Tobiah and trouble both start with a capital T. Traitor, okay. What was his famous quote? Do you remember? Okay, if a fox jumps on this wall, it's going to fall down. Who was he associated with? Do you remember? Sanballat, the Horonite. Tobiah was an Ammonite, but he had a Jewish name. And so you can start to see some of the difficulties here. In chapter 2, verse 10, it said that he was displeased when they were starting to rebuild the wall. In chapter 6, if you turn over back to chapter 6, just for memory's sake, I think this issue with Tobiah is very important. Chapter 6, verse 17. So this was, if you look at verse 15, the wall was finished. And then verse 17, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah the son of Arah, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam the son of Berechiah as his wife. And they also spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. And Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. So when we see this phrase that Eliashib, who is the high priest, this is the top of the ladder in the priesthood. He's closely associated with Tobiah because probably of the things we read in chapter 6. So what did he do? He prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put all those the things that were used for worship, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers for the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes of Babylon, I went to the king. So the wall was completed in 445 in a short time. 445. This would have been, the 32nd year would have been 433. So he was there for 12 years, and then he goes back to his previous place with the king. And then now he's asking, it says, after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem. So that would have been between 433 and 425 because Artaxerxes ceased being the king in 425. So we've got an 8-year window where that could have happened. So it's either 12, probably more like 16 or 17 years after they finish the wall is when this takes place. But Nehemiah was not there. And so Eliashib the priest think about this for a second. This was the place where remember at the very beginning of this, we talked about how the vessels traveled, and that was a picture of the glory of the worship of God. And now they're finally rebuilding the temple and the walls, and they've got this place where they store the vessels. And this place is cleansed for purification. And then when we say that, we're not talking about like a surgery room. We're talking about to the Lord, it was purified. This place, the sacred place where they store all these vessels. Can you imagine for him to let anybody use that as their living quarters? But he doesn't just allow anybody to do that. He allows the dedicated enemy of Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the temple to stay in the temple that he was displeased with. This is a picture, I think, for us, even in our own lives and our hearts, because Tobiah is basically, in this case, an instrument of Satan. And he's inviting the priest high priest is inviting him in to the center of the worship. Steve.
Strikes me that this is a BC version of the swamp.
Okay, a BC version of the swamp. It just continues on from one thing. You know, we had this big Reformation. You would think that after this, what were the things that they committed to? So they committed to not intermarry in this covenant. They committed to keep the Sabbath, temple obligations, provisions for the temple, dedication of the firstborn, and their tithe. That's what they just had signed a document to commit to. And now we have this. They invite Tobiah into the inner part of the temple. Any other thoughts on this? I think this applies to the fact Nehemiah was out of the picture. Tobiah was right in front of Eliashib, and they had business connections. We don't know what all those connections were, but there's the temptation to be more concerned about the man who is standing in front of you rather than the glory of the Lord. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. So Nehemiah asks leave, and he comes to Jerusalem. Then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber, and I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. So my question is, where were the vessels during this time? Where did they take them? Do you think that they saw this? Do you think Eliashib saw this as an evil act? I think this is another insight into how we rationalize. Do you think he saw this as an evil act? Would he have done it if he thought it was an evil act? He probably saw it as practical, accommodation, expedient, maybe profitable to himself, as far, not that he was maybe paying rent, but to please this man who he had ties with. And Nehemiah was very angry, and he threw all the furniture out. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like what the Lord Jesus did. Critics might have said, let's not overreact, Nehemiah. But what have we seen about Nehemiah all the way through this? We talked about it in the first couple of weeks. He had a zeal for what? What was his primary motive? When he first heard the news, all the way to this point, he had a zeal for the glory of God and nothing else. And they were trouncing on the glory of God here, and so he threw everything out. Verse 10, I also found, so they failed there. I also found portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Do you remember what the verse we looked at last week? That their quote, I kind of tried to center it on last week, the very end of chapter 10. This is the end of their covenant. Their words were, we will not neglect the house of our God. That was their covenant. And now Nehemiah comes to them and says, why is the house of God forsaken? So they failed in this covenant requirement to provide for the Levites. So what happened? The Levites, who are supposed to be able to dedicate all their time to the worship and handling the worship and making sure it goes smoothly, they had to go back to their fields because they didn't have any money, and so they had to go back, and they were kind of bivocational, so it was distracting from the glory of God. I gathered them together, I set them in their stations, then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses, and I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and as their assistant, Hanan the son of Zakur. For they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. So again, Nehemiah is organizing. I think it's interesting that he provides an assistant here. That sounds like something we would do. These are the first accountants in Jerusalem. They were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute it to their brothers. And then he has this little prayer, and he has about 4 or 5 of these in this chapter. And he says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service." So he has, again, Nehemiah is praying this several times. I don't know necessarily that there's a specific thing to draw from this, but do you have any thoughts on why we see these little prayers throughout this chapter? I have a couple thoughts on this, but I'm curious. Silas.
It makes me think of Moses standing between God and the people after they had grievously sinned.
Okay.
The thought in Nehemiah's mind that he'd spent all this time working on this, and it would be perfectly just for God to just be done with them.
Okay. I think that's true. Maybe he's feeling lonely at this point. Like, am I the only one who is upholding this? And almost like it's just him and the Lord, and that's it. I don't know if that's the case. Steve?
People who do a great work for the Lord, like Martin Luther or Martin Lloyd-Jones or whatever era, you don't want what you've done to disappear as soon as you die.
Yeah.
You want it to go on for the Lord. And so I think he's praying that all his labors were not in vain.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a great point. That's actually one of the things I want to come back to at the end. Ken?
I was wondering if that may be with false accusations from others and opponents and enemies, and he's also saying, asking the Lord to vindicate,
Okay.
to see it in his favor against the false accusations.
Yeah. He's facing accusations, and not even necessarily in this one, but in the ones that follow. And he's basically pleading his case before the Lord, like, Lord, it reminds me of Psalm 37, which is the psalm of the meek person. And it says, when you see the wicked prospering, basically, don't worry, because in a short time, you won't even be able to find them. And so Nehemiah is turning to the Lord. It's interesting, this phrase that maybe doesn't sound quite right to us, like, do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done. In other words, like, look at my Sunday school stickers or whatever. That word good deeds can also mean loyal deeds, and then the actual word behind that is hesed, which refers to the covenant love of the Lord. And so he's doing deeds in line with the covenant. He's basically doing those in response to God's covenant of love. And so he's saying, remember this. And I think Steve's point about he doesn't want this to all disappear is a good point there. Verse 15, in those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. So Nehemiah comes back, and it's almost like a bullet point list of the covenant, and he's finding one after the next that they violated. They're bringing in heaps of grain. They're loading them on the donkeys. They bring him into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So he says, I warned them on the day when they sold food. The Tyrians also, who lived in the city, it's the first time we've heard about them, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. So then I confronted the nobles and said to them, what is, again, I don't think they thought this was evil. What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act this way? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And so he puts up these barriers. He shuts the gates on the Sabbath. They had just written this long confession about how their fathers had acted and abused the Sabbath and how the wrath of God had come upon them. and they sign this covenant that they're not going to do this, think about, I said that Nehemiah's come back and looked at all the things that they've covenanted to and said, you just broke this, you broke this. I just think about the Lord Jesus coming into my life week after week and saying, you just said you weren't going to do this. You said you were going to do this, and you've not done what you said you were going to do, and you've done the things that you said you weren't going to do in a short time after you said them. You just heard a sermon last week, and you said, Lord, I need to do this more, and you haven't done it one time this week. Or I need to do this less, and you've done it every day. So it's a sad picture here. So he gives some directions. He basically is saying, I'm going to close the gates. And so what happens when he closes the gates? In verse 20, the merchants and sellers lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. So they're like, well, we'll hang out here. Maybe people will come out or hang around here and buy stuff anyway on the Sabbath. And then he says, I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay my hands on you. That's one of the best prophetic words. I will lay hands on you. And from that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. I do think we joke about that. This is a strong leader. This is not a leader who says, let's talk about this. He's coming in and he's cleaning up the mess. Because they already know. He doesn't have to explain why this is. They already know it. Then I commanded the Levites, they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. And then he has another little short prayer. Remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Now this prayer is a prayer completely of humility. If you look at the words there, remember me in my favor, spare me for what reason? According to the greatness of your steadfast love. Now we come to the next thing, verse 23. In those days also I saw that the Jews had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. So he was not messing around here. And I made them take an oath in the name of the Lord, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. We didn't even cover the section in the book of Ezra. It's a major section of that book where Ezra has to deal with the fact that they were intermarrying. This is a continual problem, and they've just covenanted, and now they're doing it again in the short time that he's been gone. And so he gives them the reason. Among them, he says, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations, there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. And so he's pointing to the fact that here's the greatest king. The Lord had given him everything. It reminds me of the passage that says, take heed lest you fall. Even Solomon fell. He couldn't even handle the intermarrying of foreign wives. It made him sin. What do you think it's going to do to you? Verse 27, shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? So they've failed at another piece of their covenant. And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, so this is the grandson of Eliashib, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So Eliashib is connected with Sanballat and Tobiah. Therefore, I chased him from me. And then another prayer, remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Eliashib has made a big mess of this, but it's not just him. Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering. This was another thing that they had covenanted to. But he had to provide for that, for the wood offering at the appointed times, and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. So, chapter 13 changes the way we feel about this book in some ways. If we would have stopped in chapter 12, it would have been this triumphant procession. They rebuilt the wall, they did the practical aspect of it, and then they reformed their practices and their worship, and they ended by dedicating the wall, and then we have this. So what are the lessons? I don't think you need me to tell you. What are some of the lessons that we see from this section? Drew.
I think one of the beauties of the Word of God is that a chapter like 13 is included, and it is because it's a reminder of man without God.
Okay.
So it shows, I mean, in Exodus and Judges, and then we get to Nehemiah, and you just see the people continually have a leader and go and follow God, and then the second they have a moment to themselves, it's kind of a reminder to us as people as well, like we spoke about. We can so often excuse the things that we do, knowing the truth, but saying, hey, I'm doing the wine press, but this is probably for the offering, right? I'm putting things of the offering in the storage room. It's not like they're gone away, it's just they're not in the same spot. That's fine, right?
Yeah.
We keep making the excuses, and there's the reminders that this is the same people. See how Nehemiah, a man of God, has responded to this. Oh, this is a great evil. So when it's seen through an eye of actually honoring God, it's like, oh yeah, this is evil, but in our eyes, we try to excuse things over and over.
Yeah.
He said it's a good reminder to us to be mindful of those things.
Definitely. This is obviously, and I think there it is. I had my notes here. I think one of the things that I pulled away from this was Nehemiah's not going to be there forever. Steve mentioned that he was, you don't want to see the work that you've put in for years to just disappear when you leave. Nehemiah had to be thinking that if I walk out the door again, they're going to be doing this again 3 years from now. And I think that relates to us. Are we that way that, well, when the pastor's here or when we're at church or when I'm held accountable, I'm one way, but when I'm on my own, when I'm in my own thoughts, when I'm free to do or I have free time, I go back to the things that the wrath of God is coming for. In the New Testament, it says, you were doing all these things, so why would you go back to them that are the account or the reason why the wrath of God is coming? Obviously, this points to the need for a Messiah, does it not? I mean, as Drew was saying, you could go through lots of books of the Old Testament, and they end in this similar fashion where we've had a victory, and then it ends like this. But it's not just in the Old Testament. Think about Paul as he goes and starts these churches and has kind of victories in different areas, starts a church, and then he spends his time writing letters to these churches dealing with problems. And Paul probably, one of the sections I'm going to read here from J.I. Packer talks about this. He was probably wondering, is this all going to disappear as far as my progress as soon as I leave? I think of the passage from Isaiah, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. We are by nature covenant breakers. That's what we are. That's what we do. We're by nature covenant breakers. We were born into a line of covenant breakers, and that's what we do. And it took a covenant between the Son and the Father and the Holy Spirit to send the Son to fulfill. And so Jesus went into a desert to basically reenact the Garden of Eden, but in a desert instead of in a garden. And he fulfilled the covenant, every little bit of it, on our behalf. He crushed the head of the serpent on the cross and in his resurrection. And now he's gone to prepare a place for us to dwell with God. Do you have that slide, Dale? So I pulled this. This is at the end of J.I. Packer's commentary on Nehemiah. And he pulls this little portion of a poem, and it's not a Christian poem. And it says, so a part of this poem, it's a father speaking to his son, and the end of this is, "You'll be a man, my son, when you..." He says, "If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim," and this is the part that I want to, or that J.I. Packer highlights, "if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, then you'll be a man, my son." Yeah, go ahead and go to the next part, the maturity part there, Dale. What does he mean if you can treat triumph and disaster as imposters? He said, so Packer says, "Triumph and disaster are given capitals as man is, but no other words in the poem are. I suppose Kipling does this because both come to us as overwhelming experiences presenting themselves in some sense as definitive and final. A moment of conscious triumph makes one feel that after this, nothing will really matter. A moment of realized disaster makes one feel that this is the end of everything. But neither feeling is realistic, for neither event is really what it is felt to be. The circumstances of triumph will not last, and the moment of triumph will sooner or later give way to moments of disappointment, strain, frustration, and grief, while the circumstances of disaster will prove to have in them seeds of recovery and new hope." So the marriage, the birth of a child, whatever the things are that are triumphant, they're probably going to be followed by difficulties. And the times when we think everything is lost, whether it's financially, whether you've totally failed at something, you've lost your job, that there are seeds of hope in that. We think that life can never have anything good left. Life in this world under God's providence is like that. It always has been and always will be. It is so in the Bible, and it remains so now in the 21st century. The mature person who is mentally and emotionally an adult, as distinct from a child, knows this and does not forget it. Those who bear responsibility for the welfare of others, spouses, parents, homemakers, leaders, pastors, organizers, managers, or whatever, and that includes most, if not all of us, will feel the ups and downs of life more acutely in proportion as those people are involved, as more people are involved with us in the events that take place. Nehemiah's sense of triumph at the completing and dedicating of Jerusalem's new wall must have been greatly enhanced by the thought that this was a triumph of the entire nation, of which, as governor, he was leader and head. So, too, his sense of disaster when he discovered on his return to Jerusalem that the revival which was in progress at the time of the dedication had almost completely run into the sand, must have been greatly deepened by the thought that this left the whole people spiritually as low, dry, and apathetic as they were before he first arrived. Yet no doubt it was awareness that this decline could happen, and perhaps news that made him suspect that it happened, that led him to ask for a second spell as governor. No doubt, too, he was sure that the God who had taken him to Jerusalem and given him success in his first term would now give him the strength and stick-to-itiveness he would need to, in quoting from the poem again, watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop to build them up with worn-out tools. So when you come back and you look at the things you spent your life on and they're broken, he's saying then you stoop down and start building them up with worn-out tools. I think that's probably how Nehemiah must have felt. And I want to read one, we got 2 minutes here. One more thing from Packer. When he talks about these prayers that Nehemiah is praying, and he's talking about the faithfulness of Nehemiah. He says, Nehemiah's passion was for faithfulness. Whether he had been appointed to succeed, he did not know. But he knew he was called to be faithful to the word of God in all things. Similar things could be said about Paul when he says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. He does not know whether he has been a success or not. All he is sure of is that he has been faithful, holding fast to God's truth. He says, Christ will build his church using us as he wills in ways that involve the appearance of triumph and disaster over and over again. Our part is not to let either appearance fool us, but to maintain an unflinching fidelity to the particular tasks and roles we know we have been given to fulfill. Such faithfulness, the grace of zealously keeping on, whether discouraged or encouraged, with a humility that stays constant when encouraged no less than when discouraged, is the final lesson that Nehemiah has to teach us. And it is a lesson that we shall only ever learn through divine help that is found by keeping close to Jesus Christ. It is our wisdom to take Jesus Christ, veteran of the seeming triumph of Palm Sunday and the seeming disaster of Good Friday, as our trainer in Nehemiah-like behavior, and to know that the faithfulness in which he drills us is his own gift to us through the power of the Holy Spirit. So we're not called to be successful. We're called to be faithful in triumph and disaster, and that's the picture that Nehemiah gives to us. So I wish we could spend a little more time talking about what you pulled out of Nehemiah, but we're out of time. So you are dismissed. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you.